The 5 major hazards we face today are biological, chemical, physical, cultural, and lifestyle choices. Biological hazards include pathogens, which are living organisms that can cause disease in other organisms. For example, bacteria, viruses, parasites, protozoa, and fungi. The next is chemical hazards. Chemical hazards are harmful chemicals in the air, water, soil, and food. Physical hazards include fire, earthquakes, volcanoes, floods, and storms. Cultural hazards are unsafe working conditions, unsafe highways, criminal assault, and poverty. Lifestyle choices include smoking, eating too much, drinking too much alcohol, and unsafe sex. PCBs are a class of more than 200 chlorine-containing organic compounds that are very stable and non-flammable. They were widely used between 1929 and 1917 in lubricants, hydraulic fluids, and electrical insulators in transformers and capacitors. In 1977, research showed that they could cause liver and other cancers in test animals as well as humans. In 1996, a study showed that fetuses exposed to PCBs in the womb had learning disabilities. Although PCBs were banned in the United States and in other countries, the potential health threats are still around. For decades, PCBs entered the air, water, and soil during their manufacture, use, and disposal. Because PCBs break down very slowly in the environment, they can travel long distances in the air and be deposited far away from where they were released. PCBs can also be biologically magnified in food chains and web. Because of this, PCBs are now found in soil, air, lakes, rivers, fish, birds, and your body. According to the EPA, about 70% of all PCBs made in the United States are still in the environment today.
Approximately 40% of the world's population live in areas in which malaria is prevalent. Malaria kills approximately 1 million people, as many as 2 million per year. There are many solutions in order to solve for these infectious diseases, including research on tropical diseases and vaccines, reduction in poverty, decrease in malnutrition, improvement in drinking water quality, reduce unnecessary uses of antibiotics, educating people on antibiotic prescription, reducing antibiotic use to promote livestock growth, requiring careful hand washing by all medical personnel, immunization of children, providing oral rehydration for diarrhea victims, and conducting global campaigns to reduce such diseases.
Other chemicals harm our immune, nervous, and endocrine systems. An example of these are neurotoxins. Some examples of neurotoxins are PCBs, methylmercury, arsenic, lead, and certain pesticides. Other chemicals can harm our endocrine system. This system is in charge of releasing hormones into our blood systems. Certain chemicals, called hormonally active agents, can mimic hormones. Exposure to low levels of these chemicals can impair reproductive systems and sexual development and cause physical and behavioral disorders.
Because of this, many scientists believe that we should reduce our use of such chemicals, but many others believe we don't have enough evidence to completely end our use of such substances.
There are 3 major types of chemical hazards that we face today. The first are carcinogens. These chemicals promote cancer. PCBs that we just talked about are carcinogens. The next type are mutagens. These chemicals cause mutations or changes in the DNA molecules found in cells. The last kind are teratogens. These chemicals cause harm or birth defects to a fetus or embryo. An example of this is alcohol, which is why drinking during a pregnancy can lead to offspring with low birth weight and a number of physical, developmental, behavioral, and mental problems.
How do we perceive risks and avoid them? The number one cause of death in the world is poverty, with 11 million deaths in total. The next is tobacco, followed by pneumonia and the flu, air pollution, HIV and AIDS, diarrhea, tuberculosis, car-related accidents, work-related injuries, malaria, hepatitis B, and then measles with 800,000 deaths. There are a lot of causes that can lead to death. There are tons of life shorters, as we call them, that are on a list. Smoking, poverty, obesity, all on the top. The surprising one is being born male, which actually shortens your life 7.5 years. The main thing when coming to these conclusions of how we should evaluate our life is to evaluate in terms of risk. So how we're going to compare risk is through 4 ways. How it affects us, determining how much risk you will accept. So like if you want to go skydiving or something, that's not for me. There are a lot of ways to avoid these risks, including comparing the risks, determining how much risk a person will accept, which includes just being deciding what you're going to do with your life. So like someone will go skydiving, whereas I personally wouldn't. Determining the actual risk involved in terms of like life-threatening ability, and then you have to evaluate your life choices. Like the skydiving example is a perfect one here. Risk analysis is really important in making life decisions. There are many different ways that you can die, as seen previously. Risk analysis is really important in identifying the hazards as well as how to manage the risk involved.
This graph shows the 3 major causes of death in the United States and in the world. Cardiovascular disease caused 30% in the world and 39% in the United States. Infectious diseases caused 30% in the world and 7% in the United States. And cancer caused 17% in the world and 23% in the United States.
We are exposed to many different potentially harmful chemicals every day in the air that we breathe, the food that we eat, and the water that we drink. Toxicology is the study of a chemical's effects on a human or another animal. Toxicity is the measure of these effects, so like the illness and the injury that they incur. An important principle of toxicology is any substance can be harmful if you eat enough of it. So toxicology is basically studying how much of something do you have to eat before you die. There are many variables in determining this toxicity, some of which include age, the dose, which is the amount ingested, genetic makeup, solubility, and permeability. All of this results in a response. An acute response means it's an immediate response, or a chronic response means it's a long-term effect. Age is a major factor in how a substance will affect you. Children are more affected by harmful substances than adults for a variety of reasons. Firstly, they breathe, eat, and drink more per body weight than adults do. Secondly, they play in the dirt and they're exposed to more of the ground than adults are. And third of all, they have less developed immune systems. Usually it is suggested that children are 10 times more affected by a substance than an adult is, but many experts advise that we should actually consider them to be 100 times more affected than adults are. This is generally studied by looking at a dose-response curve. The dose-response curve is a graph where you plot the amount ingested compared to the response of the person ingesting the stuff. There are generally 2 kinds of this kind of graph. The first is a threshold dose-response graph. This means a certain amount must be attained in order to see a response, and the more ingested means more response. A non-threshold dose-response graph means any amount ingested causes any amount of harm. So how do we find out toxicity levels? A lot of times, scientists test substances on animals. They use high dosages in order to save money, time, and the amount of animals that they use. Other more efficient ways of testing toxicity include math simulations, lab simulations, and testing on egg membranes or actual animal cells instead of a live animal. The United States is moving farther in this direction, not only because of efficiency and cost, but also because of cruelty to animals. These experiments and simulations aren't always accurate because they often fail to account for the many different substances that everyone interacts with every day. Many of these substances are called trace substances, where there's just a little bit everywhere. Should we worry about trace substances? It's hard to say because there is very little data and research. It's possible that trace levels are increasing, but it's also possible that we're just getting better at detecting them. And so where does this leave us? There's potentially harmful substances everywhere, and we know very little about them. Most of Europe is applying precautionary pollution prevention. This principle basically says if we don't know the effects of a chemical, we should just assume that it's very hazardous. This would mean we should assume many chemicals are very harmful until proven otherwise and should treat them as such before releasing them into the environment. And we would also get better at detecting harmful substances and removing them from our shelves, from our bodies, and from the world. This is important to not only the health of the world, but the health of individuals.
Tuna are some of the most popular fish in the world, with more than 4.3 billion tons caught each year. Rising mercury levels in fish cause some to wonder if we should be consuming so much fish. A study in 2003 looked at the mercury levels in 1971 and 1998 and concluded that mercury levels were stable. This is what the public and the FDA base their regulations on, which goes to show how important it is to look at data from recent years. A more recent study shows that mercury emissions are on the rise, thanks to our lovely friends, coal-fired power plants, and destructive mining operations. The earlier study failed to look at the size of the tuna caught, which is important to do because mercury accumulates over time. But the most recent study did take fish size into account and found that mercury levels are rapidly rising.
Now before you all take your quiz, let's review some vocab. Pause this video when the words scroll onto the screen so you can quiz yourself before I give you the answer. Here's the 17.1 vocab. How much of it do you know? Risk is basically the probability of suffering. Risk assessment is basically scientifically figuring out how much suffering would come from certain actions. Risk management is basically deciding what actions to take based on risk assessment, and pathogens are live organisms that cause illness in other organisms. This is the vocab from 17.2. There's only two, so I should assume that you know both of them. An infectious disease is when a pathogen enters the body and creates a disease. But a non-transmissible disease is one not caused by living organisms and cannot be passed between two organisms. In 17.3, we learned about chemicals and their relation to human growth and birth defects and other kinds of diseases and illnesses. A toxic chemical is a substance that can cause long or short-term damage to an animal or human being. A carcinogen is a substance that causes cancer. A teratogen is a chemical that causes harm or birth defects to a fetus or embryo. And a mutagen is a chemical or a form of radiation that causes mutations or changes in the DNA. Almost there. Here's the 17.4 vocab. Toxicology is the study of a substance's effects on a living being. Toxicity is the measure of said effects. A response is a measure of the damage to health. A dose-response curve is a graph of these various effects of various doses on a living being. One last word for 17.5, risk analysis, which is just identifying hazards and evaluating their associated risks. Nice job, everybody. We did it. Chapter 17. We all learned. We all made it. So proud. I'm so happy.